Picture this. A narrow valley in the Galilee early morning, the smell of crushed grass and iron in the air. The fighting is already over. Bodies of horses lie in the shallow water of a spring that farmers have used for 1,000 years, a spring the local people call the Spring of Goliath. The dust is still settling, and through that dust a group of Mamluk soldiers drags a man forward. A commander, his armour scorched, his hands bound, his back straight even now. He does not beg. He does not look away. When they bring him before the Sultan of Egypt, he speaks like a man who has already accepted his fate, warning them that his master will avenge him with an army that will darken the sky. That prisoner is Kitbuka, and until that morning, he served the most feared war machine the medieval world had ever seen. We are told the Mongols could not be beaten. We remember them as a wave that could not be stopped, the horde that erased kingdoms, that turned Baghdad, the jewel of the Islamic world, into ashen silence only 2 years earlier. For 50 years, from the steppes of Mongolia to the gates of Europe, city after city had learned the same lesson. Resist and you are annihilated. Submit and you are ruled. But on this day, in this valley, something happened that the chroniclers of the age could barely bring themselves to record. The horde that conquered the world met an enemy it could not break, and it lost. How did it happen? How did a dynasty of former slave soldiers, ruling from Egypt, do what emperors, caliphs and kings had all failed to do? Was it strategy, faith, or simply the cruel timing of a death half a world away that no one saw coming? Quick thing before we go deeper. Where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments. And if you're new here, subscribe now, because what happened next in the Galilee is a story the chronicles barely dared to record, and you won't want to look away. To understand why this valley mattered so much, you have to understand what the world looked like in the year 1260. You have to understand a machine of conquest that had spent 2 generations swallowing empires, and a kingdom of soldiers who had decided against all reason that they would rather die fighting than kneel. This is not just the story of one battle. It is the story of the moment the tide of history stopped rising and began for the first time to fall back. To grasp the scale of what the Mamluks faced, you have to go back to the steppes of Central Asia, decades before that morning in the Galilee. In the year 1206, a man named Temujin united the warring tribes of Mongolia under a single banner and took a new name, Genghis Khan. What he built was not merely an army, it was a system. The Mongol war machine ran on discipline, speed and terror in equal measure. Its horsemen could ride for days on dried meat and mare's milk, cover ground no European army could match, and loose arrows from the saddle at a full gallop. They divided their forces into precise units of tens, hundreds and thousands, each answerable to the next, so that a single commander could move tens of thousands of riders as if they were fingers on one hand. By the time Genghis Khan died in the year 1227, his empire already stretched across a vast belt of Asia. His sons and grandsons pushed further still. They shattered the kingdoms of the Rus. They rode into Poland and Hungary and stood, for a terrifying season, at the doorstep of Central Europe. They conquered northern China, and everywhere they went they refined a single, brutal message. The world had a choice between submission and destruction. For the peoples in their path, resistance seemed almost like madness. Cities that closed their gates were made into examples. Chroniclers across the Islamic world, the Christian world, and beyond wrote of the Mongols in the language of apocalypse, as if they were a punishment sent from God rather than an army of men. And yet, for all its terror, the empire had a hidden weakness, one that no single enemy could see, but that lived inside the horde itself. It was too big to rule from one place. Governing it required a great Khan, a supreme ruler, chosen by assembly. Whenever that supreme ruler died, the empire's princes were expected to return home, sometimes across thousands of miles, to take part in choosing the next. This meant that at any moment, a distant death could freeze a campaign in its tracks. A general standing at the edge of new conquest might suddenly be forced to turn around and ride east, abandoning everything, because succession mattered more than territory. No one on the western frontier understood, in the year 1260, just how much that single flaw was about to shape their fate. The horde looked like a force of nature, but it was still made of men bound by politics, ambition and blood. And in the mountains and deserts of the Middle East, that truth was about to be tested as never before. The man tasked with completing the conquest of the Islamic heartland was Hulagu Khan, a grandson of Genghis. He was sent west by his brother, the great Khan Munka, with one of the largest and best supplied Mongol armies ever assembled. His orders were sweeping, to subdue or destroy every power that stood between Mongol territory and the Mediterranean. Hulagu was methodical. He first crushed a network of fortress strongholds in the mountains of Persia, reducing castles that had defied kings for generations. Then he turned toward the greatest prize of all, Baghdad. For 5 centuries, Baghdad had been the beating heart of the Islamic world. It was the seat of the Abbasid Caliphate, a city of scholars, libraries, poets, and physicians, a place whose name meant civilization itself. The caliph who ruled there was, in theory, the spiritual leader of much of the Muslim world. In the year 1258, Hulagu's army surrounded the city. The caliph, misjudging both the danger and his own strength, refused to submit on Mongol terms. It was a fatal error. The siege was short and merciless. When the walls were breached, the city that had stood as a symbol of learning for half a millennium was overwhelmed. The libraries were destroyed. The population suffered catastrophically. The last Abbasid caliph was put to death, and with him ended a line that had endured for more than 500 years. The psychological shock of Baghdad's fall cannot be overstated. To the Islamic world, it was as if the sky had cracked open. The city that everyone believed God himself protected had been erased. If Baghdad could fall, nothing was safe. Hulagu did not pause. His army rolled west towards Syria, and the pattern repeated. In the year 1260, he took Aleppo after a hard siege, and the great city of Damascus opened its gates rather than share Baghdad's fate. The Ayyubid princes who had ruled Syria either fled, submitted, or were swept aside. Christian rulers in the region, including the king of Armenia and the prince of Antioch, allied themselves with the Mongols, sensing which way the wind was blowing. By the middle of that year, the map told a terrifying story. Mongol power now stretched from the steppes of Asia all the way to the eastern shore of the Mediterranean. Only one great Islamic power remained standing in the region, Egypt, ruled by a young and precarious dynasty of soldiers who had themselves seized their throne only a decade before. Hulagu sent envoys to that dynasty carrying a message that was less a letter than an ultimatum. Submit, surrender, and perhaps be spared. Resist, and meet the fate of Baghdad. To the men who received it, the choice must have seemed almost cruel, because everyone knew what happened to those who defied the horde. But in Egypt, something unexpected was waiting. Not a trembling court, but a group of hardened warriors who had already decided that some things were worse than war. To understand who stood against the Mongols, you have to understand one of the strangest ruling classes in all of history, the Mamluks. The word itself means, roughly, one who is owned. The Mamluks were slave soldiers, boys purchased young from the lands north and east of the Islamic world, often from the very steppe cultures that produced Mongol horsemen. They were taken far from their homelands, converted to Islam, and raised inside a brutal elite military system. They learned to ride, to shoot, to fight with sword and lance, and above all to obey and to endure. But these were not ordinary slaves. Once trained, they became the finest cavalry in the region, professional warriors bound by loyalty to their masters and to one another. Over time, they grew so essential to the armies of Egypt that they became more powerful than the rulers they served. And in the year 1250, in the chaos following a struggle over the throne, the Mamluks did the unthinkable. They seized power for themselves. Now Egypt was ruled not by a dynasty of kings born to purple, but by former slaves who had fought their way to the top and intended to keep it by force. It was an unstable arrangement, full of rivalry, ambition, and sudden violence. Sultans rose and fell quickly. Loyalty was a currency spent carefully. At the head of this fragile state, by the year 1260, stood a sultan named Qutuz. He was himself a Mamluk, a man with a hard past and, according to tradition, a personal history that gave him reason to hate the Mongols. Some accounts claim he had been enslaved as a boy after Mongol raids devastated his homeland far to the east. Whether every detail is true, the reputation stuck. Qutuz was seen as a man who would not bend. Beside him, and often against him, stood another figure who would loom even larger over the century to come, Baibars. Where Qutuz was the sultan, Baibars was the storm. Tall, fierce, and brilliant in the field, Baibars had already made a name for himself years earlier fighting European crusaders, where his tactical instincts had helped shatter a Christian army. He was ambitious, dangerous, and utterly without illusions. The relationship between these two men was tense. Baibars had his own claim to power and his own grievances, yet in the face of the Mongol threat, the two set aside their rivalry, at least for a time, because they understood something that many others did not. They understood that the ultimatum from Hulagu was not a negotiation, it was a countdown. Submitting would not save Egypt. It would only delay the end and hand the horde the last free power in the region without a fight. To men who had clawed their way from slavery to a throne, surrender was not survival. It was a slower kind of death. So when those Mongol envoys arrived in Cairo carrying their message of doom, the Mamluks did not tremble. They made a decision that shocked the age, a decision that made war not just likely, but absolutely certain. By the summer of the year 1260, the situation for Egypt looked close to hopeless. Everything that could go wrong for the Islamic world had gone wrong. Baghdad was gone. The caliphate, the symbolic centre of Sunni Islam, had been extinguished. Aleppo had fallen, Damascus had submitted. The great cities of Syria, one after another, had either been conquered or had opened their gates. The Ayyubid princes who had once ruled these lands were scattered, some of them now riding alongside the Mongols as vassals, hoping to survive by serving the very power that had destroyed their world. Refugees streamed south into Egypt, carrying stories of what had happened in the north. Each story sharpened the same terror. The Mongols were not just another army. They were the end of things. From a strictly military standpoint, the advantages all seemed to lie with the horde. The Mongols had momentum, a record of unbroken success, and a psychological weapon more powerful than any siege engine. The simple, crushing belief, shared by their enemies as much as by themselves, that they could not be beaten. Armies had disintegrated before them without a proper fight, simply because the men in them believed resistance was pointless. The Mamluks, by contrast, were a young regime sitting on an unstable throne. Their rule over Egypt was barely a decade old. Their leadership was divided by rivalry, and they were being asked to march out and confront the only army in the world that had never known a decisive defeat. Worse still, the geography favoured the invaders. If the Mongols pushed south from Syria into Palestine and then into Egypt, they would be entering the last defensible corridor before the Nile, lose that corridor, and there would be nowhere left to make a stand. Egypt's rich, populous heartland would lie open, and with it the road to North Africa and the entire southern Mediterranean. This was the true stake at Ain Jalut, though no one yet knew the battle by that name. It was not simply the survival of one dynasty, it was whether Mongol power would spill out of Asia and the Middle East and pour into Africa itself. A Mongol victory here could have reshaped the religious, political and cultural map of the world for centuries. And yet, precisely because the odds looked so overwhelming, the Mamluks understood their one real advantage. The enemy expected them to break. The enemy had built its entire reputation on the certainty that resistance was suicide. If the Mamluks could shatter that certainty, even once, even in a single field, they could break something far more important than an army. They could break a myth. But to do that they needed two things they did not yet have. They needed a moment of weakness in the horde, and they needed the courage to march north and seize it, knowing that if they failed, there would be no second chance and no mercy. Then, from a place none of them could have predicted, that moment of weakness arrived. The turning point of this entire story did not happen on a battlefield. It happened thousands of miles away in the east, with the death of a single man. The great Khan Mongol, Hulagu's brother, the supreme ruler of the entire Mongol Empire, died in the year 1259 while campaigning far away in China. News travelled slowly across the vast distances of the empire, but when it finally reached Hulagu in the west, its implications were immediate and enormous. With the supreme throne suddenly empty, the empire faced a succession crisis. Mongol's brothers and their supporters would now compete for the position of Great Khan, and that competition threatened to tear the empire apart. Hulagu, as a prince of the ruling house, could not simply ignore it. His own interests, his own future, and the balance of power within the family were all at stake. So Hulagu did what the structure of the Mongol Empire demanded. He turned his gaze east. He withdrew the bulk of his massive army from Syria and led it back toward the heart of the empire, positioning himself for the struggle over succession, and, some sources suggest, because the western pastures could not easily support so many horses and men for long. This is the hinge on which the whole story turns. The unstoppable force that had crushed Baghdad and Damascus did not stay to finish the job in the west. It largely left. What Hulagu left behind was a garrison force, significant, but only a fraction of the army that had terrorized the region. Command of that remaining force fell to one of Hulagu's most trusted generals, Kitbuka, the man we met at the very beginning of this story. Kitbuka was a capable and experienced commander. He was also, notably, a Christian of the Nestorian faith, which shaped his alliances with Christian powers in the region. He held Syria with his reduced army, continued to project Mongol dominance, and prepared to deal with Egypt in due course. But the truth was that the situation had quietly, fundamentally changed. The horde that faced Egypt now was not the invincible tide of the previous years. It was a strong but limited force, operating far from its supply base, in territory it had only just conquered, surrounded by populations that hated it and princes who obeyed only out of fear. In Cairo, the Mamluks understood exactly what this meant. For the first time, they were not facing the full might of the Mongol Empire. They were facing a wing of it, cut off from reinforcement by thousands of miles and a succession crisis. The window that everyone had assumed would never open had cracked ajar. Qutuz and Baibars did not hesitate. This was the moment they had been waiting for, whether they had dared to hope for it or not. But seizing it required a declaration so bold, so final, that it would burn every bridge behind them. There could be no more waiting, no more diplomacy, no possibility of retreat into submission. To fight the horde, they first had to make war unavoidable, and they were about to do exactly that in a way no one could take back. When the Mongol envoys arrived in Cairo bearing Hulagu's ultimatum, they expected the same response they had seen everywhere else: fear, calculation, and eventual submission. The message they carried was blunt. It reminded the Mamluks of what had happened to Baghdad. It offered survival in exchange for surrender, and promised destruction for defiance. Qutuz gave his answer in a way that left no room for interpretation. He had the envoys executed. It is difficult to overstate how enormous this decision was. In the world of the 13th century, and especially within the Mongol code of war, the killing of envoys was among the gravest acts imaginable. To the Mongols, harming an ambassador was not merely an insult. It was an unforgivable declaration of total war, the kind of act that, in their eyes, justified the complete annihilation of a people. Cities had been wiped from the earth for far less. Qutuz knew this. That was precisely the point. By executing the envoys, he made peace impossible. He removed forever the option of submission, not just for himself but for every Mamluk who followed him. There would be no negotiating a surrender later, no quiet accommodation. The Mamluks were now committed to victory or extinction. It was a way of forcing his own divided, frightened commanders to fight with the desperation of men who had no other choice. Then Qutuz did something even more audacious. He did not wait for the Mongols to invade Egypt. He marched out to meet them. Gathering his army, with Baibars commanding a key portion of the force, Qutuz led his men north out of Egypt and into Palestine. This was a stunning reversal of the expected script. Instead of hunkering down behind the Nile and waiting for the horde to come to him, he chose to carry the war into the contested ground of the Galilee, to fight on open terrain of his own choosing. Along the way, the Mamluks negotiated a crucial understanding with the Crusader states along the coast. The Christian lords of the region, ruling their shrinking territories, were caught between two dangers. Some had leaned toward the Mongols, but others recognized that a Mongol conquest of Egypt would be catastrophic for everyone. In the end, the Crusaders allowed the Mamluk army to pass through and resupply near their territory, staying neutral rather than joining the Mongol side. It was a small thing on the surface, but it mattered. It let the Mamluk army reach the battlefield in fighting condition. As the Mamluks advanced, Kitbuka learned that the Egyptians were not cowering behind their river. They were coming to him. He gathered his forces, including his Mongol corps and his allied contingents drawn from the local powers he now commanded, and moved to intercept the Mamluk army. The two forces were now converging on a broad, hill-ringed valley in the Galilee, near that ancient spring the locals called the Spring of Goliath, in Arabic, Ain Jalut. The name carried its own weight. This was a land steeped in stories of the small defeating the mighty, of unlikely victories against impossible odds. Now, in the year 1260, that ground was about to host the most important such story of the entire century. The stage was set. On one side, the last free army of the Islamic heartland, fighting with the desperation of men who had burned every bridge. On the other, the war machine that had never known defeat. The morning of the 3rd of September was coming, and with it, the reckoning. On the morning of the 3rd of September, in the year 1260, the two armies faced each other across the valley of Ain Jalut. The exact numbers are debated by historians, but most agree the forces were roughly comparable in size, each numbering in the range of tens of thousands, with neither side holding the crushing numerical advantage that had defined so many earlier Mongol victories. For once, the horde would have to win on tactics and courage alone, not on overwhelming force and reputation. Kitbuka commanded the Mongol army with confidence. His men had never lost. The very idea of defeat was foreign to them, and the Mongols had a favourite tactic they had used to destroy countless enemies, the feigned retreat. They would pretend to flee, luring an overeager opponent into breaking formation and chasing them, then wheel around and encircle the scattered pursuers. It had worked 100 times, but the Mamluks knew this tactic intimately. Many of them came from the same steppe traditions as the Mongols. They had been raised in the same style of horse warfare. They understood the trap because it was, in a sense, their own inheritance. And Baibars, who, according to tradition, commanded the vanguard, intended to turn the Mongols' favourite weapon against them. As the battle opened, the Mamluks under Baibars engaged and then began to fall back, drawing the Mongol vanguard forward. Kitbuka, sensing an opportunity, pressed the attack hard, driving into what looked like a retreating, faltering enemy. His men surged ahead through the valley, committing themselves to the pursuit. It was exactly what the Mamluks wanted. The bulk of Qutuz's army lay concealed and waiting in the hills that ring the valley. As the Mongols pushed deep into the low ground, the trap closed. Mamluk forces swept down from the surrounding heights, striking the Mongol flanks and cutting off their line of advance. The pursuers had become the surrounded. What followed was a savage, grinding struggle. The Mongols, realizing they had been drawn into an ambush, fought with the ferocity that had made them legendary. At one point in the battle, the fighting turned badly against the Mamluks, and a portion of their line began to give way under the Mongol counterattack. The battle hung in the balance. According to tradition, it was here that Qutuz threw off his helmet so his men could see his face, and rode into the thick of the fighting, calling out to rally his soldiers in the name of Islam and Egypt. Whether the details are exact, the effect was real. The Mamluk line held, reinforcements were committed, and slowly the tide turned decisively against the Mongols. Now, surrounded, outmanoeuvred, and unable to break free, the Mongol army began to collapse. Some allied contingents fighting under Mongol command wavered and fled, worsening the disaster, but Kitbuka himself did not run. In keeping with everything we know of Mongol commanders, he refused to abandon the field. He fought on until his horse was brought down and he was captured. Dragged before Qutuz, Kitbuka met his end without submission. Tradition records a final exchange of defiant words, in which he warned his captors of the vengeance to come. Then he was executed. The unthinkable had happened. In open battle, on fair ground, without any decisive advantage in numbers, a Mongol army had been surrounded and destroyed. The myth of invincibility that had terrified the world for 2 generations lay broken in a valley in the Galilee. The victory at Ain Jalut was total, but the Mamluks understood immediately that a single battle was not the same as security. They moved quickly to seize everything the moment had made possible. With the Mongol field army in Syria destroyed and Kitbuka dead, the Mongol grip on the region collapsed almost overnight. The Mamluks swept north, and the great cities that had bowed to the horde now turned again. Damascus was retaken. Aleppo followed. The garrisons and officials the Mongols had left behind were driven out or overwhelmed. Within a remarkably short time, the entire Mongol conquest of Syria, the work of a devastating campaign, was undone. For the populations of these cities, the reversal was staggering. Only weeks earlier, the Mongols had seemed like the unstoppable masters of the world. Now their power in the West had been shattered by an enemy everyone had written off. The psychological shock ran in the opposite direction this time. If the horde could be beaten, then the future was no longer written in advance. But even in triumph, the old poison of Mamluk politics did not sleep. The alliance between Qutuz and Baibars had always been one of necessity, not affection. Baibars had ambitions of his own and grievances that ran deep. According to the traditional accounts, he had expected to be rewarded with the governorship of a great city, such as Aleppo, for his role in the victory, and Qutuz denied it. On the march back toward Egypt, the rivalry reached its lethal conclusion. In a plot involving Baibars and other conspirators, the Sultan Qutuz was assassinated, the victor of Ain Jalut. The man who had made war unavoidable and stared down the horde was killed by his own commanders before he could enjoy the fruits of his greatest triumph. Baibars seized the throne of Egypt for himself. It was a brutal, characteristic ending to the Mamluk story. Power taken by force, loyalty subordinated to ambition, a great victory immediately followed by a murder. And yet, in one of history's grim ironies, the man who took the throne this way would go on to become one of the most formidable rulers of the entire medieval Islamic world. For the Mongols, the aftermath was a bitter and enduring humiliation. When Hulagu, away in the east, received word of the disaster, he was reportedly furious. He wanted vengeance, but he could not simply return and crush Egypt as he might have wished. He was now entangled in the wider politics of the fractured empire, including a growing and bitter rivalry with a fellow Mongol prince ruling to the north, whose domain had converted to Islam and who had his own reasons to oppose Hulagu. This internal division within the Mongol world proved decisive. The horde, which had once seemed a single monstrous force, was now fighting itself. Mongol armies would clash with other Mongol armies. The unity that had made the empire so terrifying was fracturing along the fault lines of family, faith, and ambition. The Mongols did not give up on the region entirely. In the years and decades that followed, they would launch further campaigns and win some engagements, but they never again came close to conquering Egypt. Ain Jalut had done something no negotiation could undo. It had proven, in front of the whole world, that the limit of the horde had finally been reached. In the long story of the medieval world, Ain Jalut stands as one of those rare moments where the direction of history visibly changed. It was not the largest battle of its age, it did not involve the greatest number of soldiers, and yet its consequences rippled outward for centuries. Most immediately, it marked the furthest limit of Mongol expansion toward Egypt and Africa. The horde that had rolled out of the steppes and swallowed empires from China to the Middle East reached its western boundary in that valley in the Galilee, and it never crossed beyond it toward the Nile. The rich lands of Egypt and the whole of North Africa were spared a conquest that might have reshaped the religious and political map of the world. The Islamic heartland, so recently on the edge of total collapse after the fall of Baghdad, had found a wall the Mongols could not breach. For the Mamluk state, the victory was transformative. A young, unstable regime of former slave soldiers had won the prestige of saving Islam from the horde. That prestige gave them legitimacy they had never possessed before. Under Baibars, Egypt became the dominant power of the region. He reorganized the army, strengthened the state, and turned his energies against the remaining Crusader strongholds along the coast, capturing fortress after fortress and beginning the long process that would eventually end the Crusader presence in the Holy Land. He even installed a member of the old caliph's family in Cairo, giving the Mamluk regime a symbolic religious authority to match its military power. The Mamluk Sultanate that emerged from this era would endure for more than 2 centuries, standing as one of the great powers of the medieval Islamic world. And it all rested, in large part, on the reputation forged in a single morning at Ain Jalut. For the Mongols, the meaning was different, but no less profound. The defeat did not destroy the empire, but it punctured its central illusion. The belief in Mongol invincibility, which had done as much work as any army, was gone. Enemies who had once surrendered in despair now knew that the horde could be met and beaten in the field, and the internal divisions that had pulled Hulagu east, the succession struggles, the family rivalries, the growing splits over faith and territory, would only deepen, fracturing the once unified empire into competing realms that increasingly fought one another instead of the outside world. But beneath all the strategy and consequence, Ain Jalut leaves us with something harder to measure. It reminds us how much of history turns on things no one can control. The Mamluks did not defeat the full might of the Mongol Empire. They defeated a fraction of it, at a moment made possible by a death thousands of miles away, the passing of a great Khan who never saw the Galilee and never knew what his death would set in motion. Had Munka lived a few years longer, had Hulagu stayed in the west with his full army, that valley might have witnessed a very different morning. So the question that lingers is this: was Ain Jalut a triumph of courage and cunning, a case of brave men seizing a fleeting chance with everything on the line? Or was it, in the end, an accident of timing, a victory handed to the Mamluks by forces far beyond their sight, which they were simply bold enough to grasp? Perhaps it was both. Perhaps the greatest turning points always are. A collision of preparation and chance, of desperate courage meeting a door that opened, for one morning only, before it could ever close again. What do you think? Was Qutuz a saviour, or a doomed man who won everything and lost his life to his own ally? Tell us in the comments. And if this story kept you here until the end, you already know what to do.